Australians could benefit from falling interest rates this year. Some economists predict the RBA will start cutting rates from around September, meaning household budgets will endure rates of 4.35% for most of this year. Analysts by 9 newspapers project Governor Michelle Bullock will start easing rates by mid-2024. There are concerns stubbornly high inflation and low jobless rates could lead the RBA to keep rates where they are for the foreseeable future. Well, for more on this, joining me live is independent economist Saul Eslake. Saul, thanks so much for your time. Do you agree with that prediction that September is when we could see to see rates coming down, meaning that we could see rates stay at about 4.35% up until then?
I'll be surprised if the Reserve Bank starts easing monetary policy as early as September. It's not impossible, but inflation would need to fall more quickly than the Reserve Bank and even Treasury are currently forecasting for the Reserve Bank to be moving that soon to unwind the increases in interest rates it's instituted over the last 18 months or so. Bear in mind, of course, that households, or at least a majority of households, will be getting some relief 3 months earlier on the 1st of July when the stage 3 tax cuts legislated by the Morrison government but endorsed by the Albanese government come into effect. And I think that's something that is obviously included in the Reserve Bank's thinking as well. But I think it means there's less pressure on them to act as soon as some economists are now forecasting.
What are you thinking that the stage 3 tax cuts could lead to more inflation? And also, isn't a lot of the inflation that we're seeing caused by high fuel prices, and there's no indication that the fuel prices are going to be coming down anytime soon this year? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's a couple of things to unpack there. No, I don't think the tax cuts will provide an independent source of additional inflationary pressure, and certainly the Reserve Bank and the Treasury aren't forecasting that, and neither am I. It's just simply that is a source of additional support for household income that I think reduces the need for the Reserve Bank to consider bringing forward reductions in interest rates. I think other central banks, the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank and the Bank of England, will probably be cutting rates even sooner than September. But of course, they have had higher rates than Australia. In the US, their equivalent of the cash rate is between 5.25% and 5.5%. In the UK, it's 5%. In Canada, it's 5%. In New Zealand, it's 5.5%. Even in continental Europe, in the Eurozone, it's 4.5%. All of those central banks have had higher cash rates than we've had. And my own view is that, although they haven't said so explicitly, the Reserve Bank has consciously chosen to tolerate inflation being above their target range for longer than other central banks in order to hold on to as much as they can of the gains that have been made in reducing unemployment over the last 3 years. And if you look at the Reserve Bank's inflation forecasts compared with those of its peer group of central banks, it is expecting inflation to come down more slowly than in those other 5 jurisdictions. And as a result, I would expect interest rates to come down more slowly as well than in the US, the UK, Canada, the Eurozone and New Zealand. Well, and as to fuel prices, they certainly were an important factor in rising inflation in the first year of it. They've been less important more recently, and despite some fears, the war in the Middle East hasn't led to a renewed surge in oil and petrol prices. There are some other concerns stemming from developments in the Middle East, especially now that ships are being routed around South Africa rather than coming through the Suez Canal, and that may provide some additional add-ons to the cost of imported products such as motor vehicles that come from Europe.
Yeah, well, we're running out of time, but I just want to ask you lastly, if you're right and interest rates do stay higher for longer, what does that do to the housing market? Because there were predictions of a 30% housing correction when interest rates were going up and up and up last year. The big banks are thinking a 6% average rise for the Australian housing market this year due to high population growth and little supply. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, what I hope is that if interest rates remain at current levels through 2024, that's my expectation, that some of the upturn in house prices that we saw from about March last year through November, December will cool off. I don't think it's in anyone's interests except existing property investors for house prices to keep going up. I know that people are worried about the prospects of house prices falling a lot, but I think ideally we could have an extended period of house prices moving sideways, allowing incomes to catch up with house prices a little bit so that housing can become more affordable for the increasing proportion of young Australians who've been shut out of the housing market over the last 20 years.
Saul Eslake, thanks so much for your time this morning. Appreciate it.
That's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.